This isn't just about one phone. In fact, it's not just about phones. If the FBI succeeds here in obtaining this broad precedent that it's asking for, it will essentially give courts through the FBI and local law enforcement agencies the power to issue demands on technology companies, not just Apple, but also Microsoft, technology companies that make the cars that run computers, medical devices, even devices that haven't yet been invented, to force these companies to send their users malicious code that is signed as if it looks like it's coming from Microsoft as a regular product update. And the effect that that would have would not just harm privacy, it would harm actual physical security for millions and millions of people all around the globe. It would also, frankly, harm US technology companies because it would put them at a disadvantage, enabling foreign companies to create secure products that banks, weapon manufacturers, and ordinary people all over the world would prefer to use.
Right, but you're saying it's a precedent. Why can't you just say, look, if a court says, do this, and it's a case where, for example, it's someone who's killed 14 people or 12 people or 3 people, then we count it, but we won't count it for the hundreds of millions that Tim Cook talked about. Why not then say, yeah, look, in cases like this we have a key, but not in others?
Well, that's simply unprecedented. That's not how U.S. courts work. If a U.S. court rules that in a criminal matter, the U.S. government has a right to essentially compel Apple to write malicious code to serve to its devices, it can do so in every type of criminal investigation. And in fact, that's not even a subject of debate anymore. Jim Comey, the FBI, members of law enforcement have now admitted that, in fact, they are seeking this precedent.
Right. Okay, let me put that to Edward Lucas. So, Edward Lucas, it would actually involve, I mean, this case seems incredibly clear-cut to a lot of people, but it's actually not about this case, it's about many, many others.
Well, I think this is both a very specific case with some very big general applications, but one has to be very careful about jumping from one to the other. This is only possible because it's an obsolete phone where this sort of hacking tool that Apple is being asked to develop would actually work. If he'd had a more up-to-date iPhone, or if his employer had given him a more up-to-date iPhone, this wouldn't work. So it's quite a specific case. I think that I can see why the privacy lobby is very worried about precedents, but this is actually not mandating a general backdoor, ruling out encryption, trying to undermine the whole way in which we depend on cryptography for modern commerce. It is actually a very specific case, and I think one has to look at I can't blame the FBI for choosing a case they're going to win, but I think their arguments in this case are quite strong.
Kade made the very specific point that the law doesn't work in a way in which this can't be a precedent for lots of other cases. Is that right? Or can you say, look, in a very small number of cases, we don't mind law enforcement having the key, but we don't want them to have a key in thousands or millions of cases?
Well, I think if there was a case where they were going to Apple and saying, we want you to produce software which will bust open every modern iPhone, Apple would then go back to court and say, this is absolutely huge and sweeping and contradicts the Fourth Amendment, and what about the privacy of the people involved? There'll be all sorts of other cases, aspects that come into play. But on this case, there is zero privacy because the guy is dead, for a start, and dead people don't have privacy rights. Moreover, it wasn't his phone. So on the very narrow ground on which this case is being fought, I think you have to be very careful about saying this is going to be a huge, horrible precedent.
But that's not what the case is about. The question is not whether or not a court can give the government access to a dead person's phone. The case is about whether or not the government can compel a private technology company to write new software to subvert existing security procedures. It's a very specific kind of precedent that would be set in this case.
But it is quite it's this Writs Act, which goes back to a few years after the Declaration of Independence, it gives very broad powers to the authorities to ask people, to request them, to do things to help law enforcement. And if you make safes, you may be in a position where the government will come to you with a court order and say, make a skeleton key which opens that safe. And if you
the fact is that that's never happened, actually. And the case that the government relies on in its brief that the court agreed with, that this judge agreed with, is a very different kind of case that has to do with a telephone company.
It's the pen register case.
Exactly, installing a technology to make available to the government information that company already processed as a central part of its business. Apple, as the central part of its business, has said that it does not want to know what is on your phone. Privacy is a very central part of why Apple has installed these encryption systems. So it's not comparable at all to the New York telephone case.
Just let me put one point to it, which is, would you support it if the Chinese government made a request like this? And if it exceeds to an American government request, isn't it then under pressure just to accede to every request from every jurisdiction?
Well, I think we've already seen big American companies rolling over under pressure from the Chinese government. I think it's deplorable. I mean, there's someone in China who's actually in jail because Yahoo decided to give the Chinese government details about who's using a particular Yahoo account. And I don't think you should give the American government and the Chinese government the same moral weight. And I think it would be deplorable if companies. I wish companies were tougher on the Chinese, but I wish they're more obedient to American courts.